This is chapter 8, recording 3. So we're talking about lifting and moving patients. If your patient is in an area where there's a huge potential for danger, a lot of times we don't have the luxury of really planning how and where we're going to move them. It's more of we have to get them out of Dodge right away. Some examples of that: fire, explosive, hazardous materials. Keep in mind that your safety and the safety of your team takes priority. Every once in a while, though, that's going to come into play. Most of the time, it's going to be we've got a couple of minutes and we need to move without fully spinal immobilizing somebody. A car is on fire, that sort of thing. This type of move is going to be when you can't properly assess the patient because of their location or position. So if you're alone, you're going to drag the patient along the long axis of the body. So dragging them in a way that you're going to keep their spine in alignment, especially if they have a spinal injury. But when it comes down to it, it's life before limb. So it's kind of our general rule. There's a couple of different techniques that you can use. There's one called the clothes drag, where you actually pull on the patient's clothing kind of around the neck and shoulder area. And I do have pictures on the next slide to show you these. There's a blanket drag, where you put the blanket underneath the patient, or a coat or something that you can pull the patient on. Keep in mind that you need to have a majority of their body weight on it, or they're just going to end up sliding off of it. So coat, make sure that you have the proper sized coat to do that. The arm drag, you're actually going to pull their arms up above their head, hold onto their wrists, and then drag them. And then the arm to arm drag, you're going to place your arms underneath the patient's shoulders, kind of underneath their armpit, and then you reach across and grab the opposite wrist, and then drag the patient backwards. So you're kind of creating a circle around them with your arms. Now, clearly her arms are far too short in this bottom right picture to be able to do that properly. So this is a modified way to do it. When you're doing the clothes drag, you just have to make sure that you get a fair amount of material in your hands. And then she's kind of supporting his head on her forearms. Sometimes you just have to get creative. There's no other way about it. If you have a patient that's within a vehicle and you're by yourself and have to get them out quickly, there's a couple of ways to do that. You want to move their legs so that they are out of the way of the pedals. You don't want them getting caught up on that. You'll then rotate the patient so that their back is towards the open door. And then place your arms under the shoulders, through their armpit, and kind of cradle their head against your body. Chances are their head is still going to flop to one side or the other. Then you're going to rapidly drag the patient from the seat to a safer location. If for some reason their feet get stuck, then you can lower them to the ground until they're on their back and then try and clear the legs from the vehicle. There are a couple of other ways to do this. One of them is called a horse collar. You actually take a blanket and you roll it up. You take the middle half of the blanket, so right at that folding point, and put that behind their neck. And then you're going to crisscross the rest of the blanket and tuck it up under their armpits so that they've got a X kind of at the front of their neck. And then the rest of the blanket is going to be up through their armpits. And then all you do is grab both of those tails and pull up, which is going to tighten that blanket around their neck, kind of helps cradle them a little bit more. And then you have those 2 points that you can turn and drag them out of the car. This is kind of a nifty little way that isn't routinely taught, but I learned it at my very first EMT conference, and let me tell you what, it works. I believe the shorter name is the Wyoming horse collar, or the longer name is the Wyoming horse collar. That's where I was born and raised. So here's kind of what they're talking about. You can see that her head is to the side. He's trying to kind of cradle it there in his glenohumeral joint, the front of the shoulder, but it's still not real fantastic. Again, this isn't when you have time to deal with the patient and get them out completely safely. This is, we need to move now. Other urgent moves that you may need to do, this may be if the patient has an altered level of consciousness, is having a hard time breathing, can't get enough air in, if they're in shock, or if there's extreme weather conditions. Then you would do the rapid extrication technique. This does require several people in order to do it safely. So you're going to do a rapid technique only if urgency exists. This is typically going to be when you have a little bit more time, but not like you're going to have tons of time. If the vehicle or scene is unsafe, if you have explosive or other hazards on scene, there is a fire or danger of fire, the patient can't be properly assisted prior to removal from the vehicle, the patient needs immediate intervention, but we actually have to have them laying down to do that. The patient has a life-threatening condition requiring immediate transport, or the patient blocks access to another seriously injured patient. When you use regular extrication techniques, it can take 6 to 8 minutes to fully and properly assess and secure a patient on a backboard. This way, they want to move you from a seated position to a supine position on a backboard in a minute or less. So definitely more urgent than what our normal speed would be. It's fairly rough overall. So if they have a spinal injury, you have an increased risk of making that worse. Again, there's a threat to their life. We have to move. You can look at other options to see if you can make the scene safe so that you have a little bit more time to play. But I mean, if you can't, you can't. It takes at least 3 providers. Typically, you want to have more if possible. Non-urgent moves, this is when everything's relatively stable. There's no immediate threat on the scene. The patient is doing pretty good. So this is going to allow you to do some pre-planning. So you want to make sure that your team leader has let everybody know what their expected role is. You're going to identify any obstacles that you could have between you and the patient, or the patient and where you're trying to take them. Make sure that you have proper equipment, and then how you're going to recover that equipment, and then actually determine how and where you're going to go. You can choose between a couple of different moves. There's a direct ground lift. This is used for patients that don't have a suspected spinal injury that are found on the ground. You can use this with patients that need to be carried over a distance to the stretcher. You can have an EMT that stands side by side to lift and carry the patient. So really you only need 2 people for this. We want you to have more if possible. So 3 would be wonderful, but minimum of 2 in order to utilize this movement technique. The extremity lift, also for patients that don't have any sort of spinal injury. And this can be with somebody who's either laying down or in a seated position. This can be helpful when you're in a small space because it doesn't really require the EMTs to be side by side. So you have a little bit more shoulder room when you're doing this one. One is positioned at the head, the other is positioned at the feet, and then you end up coordinating together. And there are skill drills on this, so make sure that you review those. Transfer moves. Direct carry is with 2 or more rescuers. You're going to move a supine patient from a bed to a stretcher, and that's skill drill 8-10. The draw sheet method. When you have 2 or more rescuers, you're going to move the patient from the bed to the stretcher using a sheet or a blanket. This is a pretty nifty little method. There's actually draw sheets themselves within the hospital that they use this on. We have some other options. Mega movers is a type of that, so you can certainly look up mega movers, but they're pretty nifty. You'll place the stretcher next to the bed, making sure it's either at the same height or slightly lower. So remember, what you're going from should be higher, what you're going to should be slightly lower. Make sure all your straps are unbuckled, your rails are down. You're going to have one person on the far side of the stretcher, kind of pushing their body into it to make sure that it doesn't move. Even with the wheels locked, if you don't hold that in place, it's going to go running away from you, and your patient will end up falling between the bed and your cot. Certainly not what we want. So you want to go ahead and make sure that the sheet is completely loose if you're using like their bed sheet. The fitted sheet is typically pretty stretchy, so we'd like to use either a flat sheet or another blanket that's not quite so stretchy. But if you have to use that fitted sheet, make sure that you roll it up and get it as tight as possible. Then you're going to have nice little handles where you roll up that blanket, and then count of 3, you end up sliding them over. And your other person should be on the other side of the bed, obviously, so that you can make that a nice smooth transition. A scoop stretcher is similar to a backboard, but it actually comes in half. So you can go ahead and put a piece of the stretcher on each side of the patient and then kind of push it together. Make sure that it locks so that you don't go to pick up your patient and then end up dropping them on the ground. Once you do that, you basically can have 2 rescuers minimum or more if you need to move them onto your actual cot. There's a couple of other carries. You can log roll the patient onto the backboard if you need to, just to use it as a movement device, not so much as an immobilization device. And then you can do a turn and pivot if you need to, where you have the patient seated on whatever surface they're moving from, and you're going to put your foot in between theirs, the one that is away from your stretcher, move the stretcher in really closely, have somebody hold on to that, and then you can go ahead and stand up the patient, rotate them around, and then sit them back down on the cot. This has to be with somebody that can at least hold their own body weight to a certain extent when standing up. An unconscious patient, obviously, you're not going to do that with. Somebody that's extremely weak, you may not want to do that with, because then you both have the potential of falling. But if they're doing relatively good with holding themselves up, you could certainly do a stand and pivot. We'll continue on in the next video.